Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Byzantine art. So, what do we mean by Byzantine art or Byzantium? What we're talking about when we're talking about Byzantium is the Eastern Roman Empire, more or less. So, what do I mean by this? So, an emperor named Theodosius, he splits the empire again. I mean, it was split and then it wasn't, and now it is again. It doesn't really matter. But his two sons split up the empire, and one rules the west and one rules the east. Now, by this time, Constantinople has already been established in the east by Constantine, named after him, as the capital of the Eastern Empire. The Western Empire is Rome until in the year 410 it is moved to Milan, and then eventually it is moved to Ravenna. The Byzantine Empire will help Christianize the area that we call the Balkans, so Macedonia, Hungary, and eventually the Slavic areas in Russia. The kind of Christianity that will be practiced in the Eastern Orthodox or in the Eastern Empire or Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire will be called Eastern Orthodox religion or Eastern Orthodoxy, as opposed to the religion that will be practiced mostly in Western Europe, which will be Catholicism. So even though technically the church is still going to be unified for, well, quite a next few centuries, really what we're going to start to see is a split, not only, well, in many ways, politically, religiously, culturally, in the two kingdoms. Because in the East, the language that will grow to dominate the Eastern Empire is going to be Greek. And the language that will sort of still proliferate in the West is going to be Latin, and then Latin is going to mutate into what we call the Romance languages, so Spanish and French and things like that, all the languages based in the Roman language, which was Latin. That's why they're called Romance languages, not because they could woo your significant other. So it's important, though, to realize, though, that the Greeks, the Greek-speaking East, the Greek-speaking Byzantines, still see themselves as Romans. They still see themselves as the carriers of the tradition of the Roman Empire. They don't see themselves as a separate thing. In fact, they're not going to call themselves Greek or Byzantines. They're going to call themselves Romans. And they're basically going to remain in control until the 1400s, until the Byzantine Empire finally follows after sort of being dwindled smaller and smaller and smaller and falls to the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Turks. And then the Byzantine Empire is no more. But it's important to understand that a large remnant of the Roman Empire will remain intact until the 15th century, until only, 600 years ago or so. So that's an important thing to kind of come to grips with. So let's look at some early Byzantine art. And you're going to see that here we are in the 6th century and the 500s. The art of this period is going to look in many ways very, very similar to the art we have been seeing of the of late antiquity and the Western Roman Empire. This is an image of the archangel. The archangels are the highest of the angels. The archangels are important because we know their names. It's archangels like, I almost said guys, but they're not men. Angels are, they are not human. They are their own sort of species of creation. They are these created creatures by God in sort of the Christian worldview, and they are not men. They are not, as we often mistake them to be, dead souls that have gone to heaven. They are a separate entity and creature unto themselves. And the highest rank of angels are called archangels. And these are the only ones that we really know the names to. So angels like Gabriel, angels like archangels like Michael. And so this is an image of the archangel Michael. we see this is dedicated to an emperor, meaning that he is basically offering the rule, God's rule on earth, to the emperor. And he says, receive these gifts, it says up at the top. This is very much based on a Nike figure. The early Christian art, and even Christian art to today, very much still draws from a Greek and Roman tradition. And so archangels and angels in general were often depicted to look like Nikes, these images of victory, which is, in terms of the Roman and Greek mythology, are probably some of the closest things to what angels are. Angels are these sort of protector and warrior entities. And so in many ways, they're very similar to Nikes in function. So like we saw in the last chapter, it was very easy for early Christians to take Greek and Roman imagery and repurpose it for Christian imagery. And that's exactly what's going on here. Now you'll notice we're also seeing the same trend that we saw in early Christian art in Rome. We're seeing a sort of slow moving away from realism. We see, this angel, even though he's somewhat realistic, he still has these rather generic eyes. His proportions are somewhat off. He doesn't have a three-dimensional sort of feel to him. He feels rather flattened, even though this is a relief sculpture, and we see the folds in his drapery. You'll also notice the folds in his drapery are becoming less realistic, and they're becoming more like just sort of abstract, random kind of patterns. Also, if you look at his feet down here, you see that he's sort of existing in kind of two spaces. While he's standing in the doorway, his feet sort of exist about a third of the way over these steps. So he's kind of both in the foreground and the background at the same time. And one of the trends that we saw in early Christian art was this sort of flattening of the space, because of this, this sort of rejection of realistic art, because realistic art was associated with the Greek and Roman pagan art. It also has a symbolic sort of meaning, though, that this creature, this archangel, literally transcends space, right? He exists both in the background and the foreground. He is not governed by the same rules. Oops, I skipped a slide. That's okay. We're going to be here in a minute. He's not governed by the same rules that we are. This is known as the Barberini Ivory, and this is a sculpture of the very powerful Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who I'll talk more about in just a moment. And we call it the Barberini Ivory because it comes from a 17th century collection of a cardinal, Italian Cardinal Francisco Barberini. We already saw the Barberini Faun, so this was a guy who held a lot of really important classical and early or late antique works of art. So at the bottom, we're seeing a sort of symbol, a visual strategy that we have been seeing since literally the dawn of civilization. We see images of winged victories carrying palms, which are symbols of victory. We also see barbarians paying tribute, bringing gifts. Once again, a symbol of sort of the ability for the ruler to provide. And then we also see images of a lion, an elephant, and a tiger. These represent the sort of exotic world beyond the borders of the empire, but sort of allude to the fact that this ruler, Justinian, has dominion over the earth. On the left, we see a Roman soldier with a smaller statue of victory, so another little Nike here. And then in the middle, we see Justinian himself. We see an equestrian portrait. We see an image of probably Mother Earth under him, Tellus. So even though this is a Christian image and a Christian emperor, we are still seeing that Greek and Roman stuff underneath. We see a Nike flying up to crown him. And so even though this is a Christian image, this is very much rooted in Greek and Roman imperial tradition, because this emperor is a Roman emperor. He would have seen himself as a Roman emperor. At the top, we see an image of Christ, a sort of youthful Christ, in a sort of circle. This circle is known as a mandorla, and these are openings into the heavens. You'll often see Christ poking his head out or standing sort of bodily inside a mandorla. He's giving his blessing. Blessing Justinian's rule. Once again, this is an old visual strategy. We can go all the way back to things like the Stele of Naram Sin, if you remember, and you will see images of rulers standing under the sort of approval of the gods, receiving the approval of the gods, as if they're, to say that their rule is a divinely sanctioned rule. If we look at the proportions, you can see we are well into the Christian era. We see those sort of squat proportions on the figure. We see a distinct lack of realism. I mean, that horse is like a pony-sized horse. It would feel like it would be struggling under the weight of the emperor. So, gone is that Greek and Roman realism. This is the Hagia Sophia. This is Justinian's sort of greatest achievement as emperor. This is one of the great, I would say, one of the great buildings of the world. This is a building that has shown up in the news very, very recently. This building served as a Christian church, which we'll talk about, for many, many years. But it has now, but then it was served as a mosque once the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople and changed it to Istanbul. And in the early 1900s, it was turned into a museum where it was sort of enjoyed by all. Now, the president of Turkey has just recently, just days ago, for sort of political and religious purposes, returned it back to being a mosque. I'm not going to get in all sort of the political and religious mechanizations and reasons for that. It is rather complicated. But this is very much a sort of political play by President Erdogan of Turkey. So these things, these old things, these ancient buildings and ancient works of art that we study still have political and social and religious resonance today. So you might be wondering, why do I care about a building that is 1,500 years old? Well, because it's still relevant and resonant today, and it is still very much a part of world politics and national identity and religious identity, and these things don't become less important over time. In many ways, they become more important over time. And so let's look at this still very relevant building, the Hagia Sophia. It was constructed by Justinian as a show of power. He had just quashed a rebellion, and the previous church built in this location was destroyed. And so as a kind of a power play, he had a new church built, the Hagia Sophia. It means literally holy wisdom. And to build it, he wanted to build something new, something unlike any other building really in the world. So he got two basically non-architects, a guy named Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Miletus, a mathematician and a physicist, respectively. So not traditional builders, but kind of theoretical dudes, to come up with this new kind of building using sort of experimental and cutting-edge mathematics. But at the same time, he wanted to create a building that sort of alluded to the previous Roman emperors. So he wanted a building that was centrally planned. He wanted a building that was domed, very much like the Pantheon in Rome, but a kind of a new Christian Pantheon. When we look at this building, we are more or less looking at a building that still resembles what it looked like when it was originally created, more or less. However, these four minarets were added much later when this building was converted to a mosque. So erase these and you pretty much have a fairly good picture of what this building originally looked like. It hasn't been altered, though, significantly. So politically, what is going on? It's very complicated, but there were basically two political groups, the blues and the greens. And the greens represented more or less the populace, the common people, and the blues represented the ruling classes. They were also associated with chariot races, so they were kind of associated with sports teams. And there had been this kind of fierce competition between these two groups for decades, and this tension sort of builds and builds and builds and builds. But because of some political moves that Justinian made, some victimizing of some very popular people, he alienates both the greens and the blues, and they both turn against him. And what happens is there's like days and days and days, weeks really, of riots, and churches are burnt, and the city is just in sort of this chaos. And both groups gather to the Hippodrome, which was this racetrack, and they are rioting. And basically what happens, although some of the blues, the people who supported the upper classes and the emperor, were allowed to leave, Justinian sent his generals and his armies to attack the people inside of this Hippodrome, killing something like 30,000 people in what were called the Nika riots, coming from the term Nike or victory, because they adopted, both sides got together and adopted the slogan win. That's what Nika means. We will win. And so they were called the Nika riots, and 30,000 people were killed. So this building has significance. Not only did it replace the church that was burnt down, but it's meant to show the power of Justinian over Constantinople, and it's meant to show his absolute rule. This building is as much a sort of a political propaganda and symbolism as it is a church, because this is the official church of Justinian, but it is very much a power play. And the fact that it resembles alludes to the Pantheon is significant. The fact that it's a domed building, kind of playing in this long line of previous established imperial buildings, is not a coincidence, or a coinkydink, whatever you want to call it. But you also notice there's some significant differences. It is not a rotunda. It's not a round building, a circular building, I should say, like the Pantheon. Also, it is the dome is not a perfect half sphere, but instead it is kind of a flattened dome. And this was all meant to give it a distinctive look. So even though it sort of alludes to Roman tradition, it's also its own independent thing. And instead of being made of concrete, the dome itself was made of brick. Another kind of declaration of its own independence, if you will, of its own thing. That is different from the Roman precedents. Kind of cool, right? So let's look at the stats. It's 250 feet long. The dome is 108 in diameter, so not quite as big as the Pantheon, but pretty big. It actually collapsed. This thing was super experimental. But nothing really had been built like this. And the original dome was actually flatter. And a few decades after it was completed, it collapsed. And so a second dome that was a little more arched was constructed. But there were some problems in the construction of this because it was so experimental. It is built on, the dome is resting on what are called pendentives. This creates the illusion that the dome is floating. So let's go look at another slide. We'll come back to that. So, the Pantheon is a dome that is sitting on a circular rotunda, right? So it's very easy to put a half circle, a half sphere on a circle, right? But how do you put a dome on top of a squarish building, which is more or less what the Hagia Sophia is? What do you do? Well, you have two sort of ways of doing that. You have what's called a squinch, where you kind of just plop down this dome on top, and then you put these little triangular kinds of wedges inside to make it fit. And it's not an elegant solution, let's put it that way. Or you could use something called a pendentive, where you basically have a column that kind of tapers down and sort of springs out in this sort of triangular fashion, creating a series of four interconnected arches springing from the bottom of the dome. And that's what the builders did with the Hagia Sophia. And what it does is it creates this almost sort of flawless transition between the dome and the rest of the building, and you don't really realize that you're looking at a circular structure sitting on top of a square structure. And this was intentional because the builders wanted to create a building that appeared as if it was not an earthly building, as that if it was an impossible building, that if it was almost a building made out of light, that it was a building made out of heavenly stuff and not earthly substances. So these pillars are made from these pillars are made from ashlar. Try to say pillar and ashlar at the same time and you get pillar. These pillars and ashlar are made from ashlar stones, which you know, ashlar masonry, or all the way back to in ancient Egypt we saw these precisely cut stones. But the rest of the building is brick, not concrete, as a way of sort of differentiating itself from Roman buildings. But a historian, a guy named Procopius, who we'll mention again later, referred to this as if the dome is suspended on a golden chain from heaven, as if the dome is floating. And you'll notice at the base of the dome is a series of windows, which were also incredibly unstable and difficult to design. But it gives this feeling that the dome is sort of floating. Now, in the center of the dome today is Islamic or Quranic script, but originally there would have been an image probably of the Virgin and Child in that dome. So all the things with Arabic writing are later, but besides these later additions, most of the imagery is from not the original building, because we'll talk about why, but around the 9th century. So they are Christian images. But also there was another guy, Paul the Silentiary, who is in charge of making sure that it remained quiet and silent in here, said, not illuminated by the sun, but the radiance is generated from within, the firmament which rests on the air. So there's this idea that you're looking at this heavenly building, this impossible building, this divine building, where everything seems to float, and there's this kind of holy light, this holy wisdom. And this comes from a very popular philosophy at the time called Neoplatonism, which I'm going to super dumb down, and I'm going to put it into a sentence which any philosopher worth his salt, or any theologian, a theological historian worth his salt, will, if they ever found me, would kick me in the teeth, and they have every right to. But to keep it simple, Neoplatonism believes that light embodies the nature of God and is absorbed by the material world. So there's this idea that God is light, and then that what we see reflecting off the surface of things is sort of a reflection of God. And so there's this whole idea to fill the Hagia Sophia with light, this literal embodiment of God. And that is what we're seeing here, this almost otherworldly, divine sort of structure. Okay, here's another great image of the Hagia Sophia. Once again, another kind of an otherworldly quality. You'll notice the proliferation of windows. The liturgy, meaning the sort of religious performance of the Eastern Orthodox Mass at this time, church services, let's get simple here, were very complicated, and they were very theatrical. And the nave of the church would not have been filled with parishioners, not with people coming to worship, but with the clergy themselves. And so imagine chanting, imagine the burning of incense, imagine long sort of processions of priests and bishops and deacons and all these different people within the church, filling it with sound and smells and a kind of a holy performance. The men would have viewed, your churchgoers would have viewed then the services from the sides, from the side aisles, from behind the columns, behind the colonnade. Whereas women would have been up in the balcony, or what was known as the gallery area, because men and women would have been separated, and they would have viewed it from up there. This sort of centrally planned design was very common in Byzantine churches. Whereas, if you remember, in Western imperial churches, central planned buildings were mostly used for baptistries and mausoleums, but they were used for churches in the Byzantine Empire. So at one point, the Byzantine Empire still controlled parts of Italy. Eventually, that will more or less fully go away. These things are so complex. But for a while, the capital of the Byzantine Empire in the west is in a place called Ravenna. And by this time, a German barbarian, an Ostrogoth, they were called, a king named Theodoric, becomes the ruler of the Roman Empire. We'll get into that in the next chapter. But eventually, it is regained by Justinian, and at least for a while. And it is dedicated by a bishop, Maximianus, in 547. So, like the Hagia Sophia, the building is rather sort of plain on the outside, but it's on the inside where all the action is. So as you can see, it's more or less a centrally planned building. In this case, it's an octagon, it's octagonal. It was originally constructed by a bishop ecclesias and a local guy, a really rich guy, Julianus the banker, provided 350 pounds of gold to build this thing, and it was completed by a guy named Bishop Maximianus. Okay, so let's look inside. So this is a church for Justinian. It was from his, this is basically his church in Italy, although he never set foot here. He never traveled here. So this is as much a kind of a show that he is in power as it is anything else. It is meant to show that he has authority and power in this city, Ravenna, that he never actually went to. So here we are inside, and as you can see, there are mosaics everywhere. Mosaics, as you guys know by now, were adopted in the early Christian era and are especially present in Byzantine art. So let's take a look at the apse. Of course, this is the area right at the end of the nave. And in the apse, we see an image of Christ. If we look up, we can see he is surrounded by two angels, and he is surrounded by a saint and the original bishop, Ecclesias, who constructed this building. In fact, you can see Christ is being offered a model of the church as sort of a tribute here. So here's Christ enthroned. Notice it's sort of hard to see, but Christ is wearing purple in this. They've kind of browned out. Sometimes purple in certain photographs appears a little more brown than purple, but he's definitely wearing purple here. So by this time, by 6th century, we're seeing kind of Christ represented as an emperor, as a ruler. Above him, we see these multiple layers of red and blue clouds. This is meant to represent the sort of layers that separate earth from the heavens. And we see, sort of Christ emerging from those. Notice the sort of inherent flatness of all of the characters. You'll also see something very evident in Byzantine art, and that is the folds of the drapery start to become very regular and start to become these almost abstract geometric patterns as we move more and more away from realism. We get these sort of layered triangular kinds of shapes. And so one of the things, if you really want to clue yourself in that you're seeing Byzantine art, look for those kind of triangular, sort of overlaying triangular, repeated triangular shapes in the patterns. This is also from the interior of Hagia Sophia. In fact, this is a mural of Justinian, a mosaic of Justinian made up of small little pieces of tile, which you guys know by now, called tesserae, which you know by now. Located, so if this is the apse, this is a mosaic off to the side, and there's another mosaic mirroring it of the emperor's wife, Theodora, we'll see in a moment, on either side. So the intention is clear, right? That Christ is above, he is the ruler, of course, but right under him is Justinian, his sort of representative on earth. Because something you need to understand is that in the Byzantine Empire, there is no separation of church and state. The emperor is also the head of the church. Whereas in the Western Empire, you have the Pope, who is the representative of Christ on earth. But under him, you have earthly rulers, right? You have non-religious rulers. So you have kings and whatnot. And even though they are ordained by God and they are chosen by God, they are not then representatives of the church. They are not the embodiment of the church in the same way that the Pope is. So it's a little bit different. So we have Justinian, who is the ruler of both the divine and the earthly realms of his empire. He is standing in the middle wearing purple and wearing a halo and a crown, show divinity and his earthly power. He is surrounded by three groups of people. We have his imperial staff, we have images of the clergy, and we have his guards. So this is sort of meant to represent all of the things that he has power over: the military, the state, and the church. We see next to him the bishop, Maximianus, and so important that he's labeled. This is the dude who finished up the building of the church. We also have symbols of the emperor's religious duties. We have what is known as the paten, or the bowl for the bread of communion. We have a Bible, of course, because this is a religion of the book, so we have to have the book. Then we have a censer, an incense burner. And then you'll notice also we have the Chi-Rho, or technically the Chi-Rho Iota, the first three letters of Christ's name. We've seen this before. It's sometimes called the Labarum, but you can call it the Chi-Rho. Whatever. I just want you to know what it is. It's that X and that P, and the P kind of extends down to an I sometimes. But it is a symbol of Christ. This is also an allusion to Constantine. Remember the first Christian emperor of Rome who won his battle at Milvian Bridge, and he had the dream where he was told that if his soldiers fought under the emblem of Christ, some interpret this as the cross, some interpret it as the Chi-Rho, then would that make them chiropractors? Anyway, chiropractors, get it? It's been a long day, guys. But we can see that there's this definite allusion to him being the ruler of church and the state. This, of course, is made up of all mosaic, so these are small little tiles to make these images. Notice the elongation of the figures, which is also common in Byzantine art, the use of these sort of geometric patterns in the drapery. Notice how the feet appear to sort of float and not touch the earth, as if these figures don't exist in three-dimensional space, but literally they've been flattened out, they've been squashed. And so these are, it's very important to establish that these are representations of people, that these are not people, these are not idols to be worshipped. So we see sort of kind of unrealistic kinds of imagery. Also, if you look at the soldiers over here, the faces are generic. The important people have individualized faces, but we overlook at the guard, and we're not looking at portraiture at all. There's no attempt to make these men look like individuals. This is the throne of Maximianus. The term cathedral literally means seat. And in both Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, the church is divided up into smaller areas, ruled over by a bishop. So think of a bishop as kind of a governor. That's the best way to think of it. This is very much a holdover from the old Roman rule. Just like early Christians borrowed a lot of imagery from the Romans, the structure of the early Christian churches were very much built on the kind of administrative designations and administrative departments of the old Roman Empire. And so bishops were very much like governors, and they had literal seats, they had literal thrones that they sat in. They were sort of the head over a specific geographical area. Let's look at the other side, though, and let's look at Theodora. Oh, Theodora. I cannot wait to talk about you because you are fascinating. Theodora is one of the most important women in history. She's one of the most powerful women in history. She's one of the most interesting women in history. But before we talk about her history specifically, let's look at the visual strategies used by the artist. So we see Theodora surrounded by her attendants, very similar to Justinian. And if we didn't know better, we would think that she was shown to hold equal power. But if we look more closely, we realize she is not, despite her halo and her crown and her purple garment, which looks brown. If we look closely, we can see that she is holding the communion cup. But unlike Justinian, who holds on to it because he is the leader of the church, it is his to hold, it is his to give. This is only hers to partake of, and then she must pass it on. We are also shown that she is flanked by imperial attendants, members of the state, but she is sort of giving them this power back. It is not hers to hold, it is her husband's, as represented by these two representatives. If we look on the far corner, we can see a curtain being pulled back, revealing a baptismal fountain. This is meant to also, of course, represent the idea of baptism and salvation in the Christian tradition, but it's also meant to show her place, which is literally off to the side in the church. So despite the fact that she appears powerful initially, her power literally comes only through her husband. Let's look at the visual strategies being used by the artist here in the depiction of people. You'll notice that her handmaidens are shown very much as generic, faceless, or not faceless, but sort of soulless kinds of generic people. These are not individualized because these women literally held no power. They were just simply attendants to the empress. The only portraits really here are of the empress herself and these two members of Justinian's, his members of the state here, representatives of the state. Let's look at how we see even more flatness here, I think, than in the other image. And notice how the artist has really embraced pattern. This is very much part of the Byzantine tradition, is this these patterns, especially these kinds of floral patterns, we'll often see. These are, I believe, absolutely stunningly beautiful. So while realism has gone away, I think it's really unfair to say that artistic expression is being sort of truncated or halted here, because I think that's absolutely not true. But we have to look at this work more as almost a kind of abstract patterns and designs instead of being a sort of realistic depiction of people. Let's zoom in on Theodora, and here you can really see those tiles and those gold covered tiles, which are just absolutely stunningly beautiful. So while Theodora is shown not having any real sort of political power, at least on paper, right? She held no real power. She was actually a very, very powerful woman. And she was incredibly influential to her husband. And she was very controversial because she was a woman and because she was of low birth. She was not born into royalty. She was actually raised by circus performers, and these were sort of the lowest of the low. Her mother was an acrobat. Her father died when she was young, and her stepfather was the keeper of animals at the circus. And he was basically given a job at the circus by some powerful leaders among the Blues, which was the political party of the ruling classes. And so she started, this kind of starts her off on her political journey. But a guy named Procopius, who was the official biographer of the king, wrote officially really nice things about, or the emperor wrote officially really nice things about the emperor and the empress. But he also wrote what was known as a secret history, where he wrote really, really terrible things about her. And he said that she was an actress, which at the time was basically a courtesan or a prostitute. And he said that she did all sorts of horrible things, that she slept with basically everything that moves. And I mean, the stuff that he wrote about her, you can read it online. Just look up Procopius' Secret History, and it is some pretty crazy stuff. And he wrote also that one of the things she did is she performed this sort of act with, how do I put this nicely? It involved breadcrumbs and geese eating breadcrumbs from a certain part of her anatomy in sort of a recreation of a Greek myth about a seduction of Zeus turning into a swan. All this stuff it's pretty salacious. It gets pretty pornographic in its description. But he said all these different things about her, which were maybe based in some truth, but certainly there's a lot of exaggeration. She eventually serves as a concubine in North Africa for a while before she meets Justinian. She becomes sort of involved in politics through her affiliation with the Blue political party. And she and Justinian meet, and he falls instantly in love with her. She's beautiful, she's strong-willed, she represents sort of everything that he's not. She comes from this sort of low background, she has this interesting life, she's very sort of self-possessed and self-determined. Why this hasn't been made into a big-budget Hollywood movie, I don't know. People of the court were against their love. It was very much a Romeo and Juliet sort of thing. And he's actually forbidden by law from marrying her because he cannot legally marry an actress. But the story is that him, since he's emperor, or actually really his uncle at the time was emperor, they changed the law and allow him to marry Theodora. And she becomes one of his most trusted advisor. When these two parties join, the Blues and the Greens join and are rioting in the streets during the Nika riots, Justinian is scared, whatless, and he's thinking about leaving. And even his advisors are saying, yeah, we should maybe get out of there. And Theodora, who has guts, looks at him and says, hey, we don't run, right? Purple is the noblest of shrouds, meaning it is better to be buried and wrapped in the robes, the purple robes of an emperor, than it is to die a coward on the run. So man up, Justinian, and let's show these people what we're made of. And that's when he very infamously locks everybody in the hippodrome and kills 30,000 people because Theodora is willing to make the hard decisions. She was also a person who helped represent a sort of outcast religious minority. Early Christianity is filled with a lot of contention. There's a lot of sort of fights about, one of the big fights was about what the nature of God. And sort of the main line, or the Chalcedonian sort of view, is that God is sort of two distinct states in one Godhood, right? It is both, Christ is both, Christ is two distinct states. It's both divine and man, but they're not the same. But there was another belief called the Monophysites. You don't have to know this but this is interesting stuff, guys. The Monophysites believed that Christ was both at once. I know it seems like a really weird thing to fight over, but it was a big deal. And she helped support these Monophysites, sometimes called Miaphysites. It doesn't matter. But what's important to know is that Theodora often fought for the underdog. She also helped underprivileged girls. She fought for women who were prostitutes to win their freedom. She was, by all accounts, kind of a badass and one of the most influential and powerful women in, I think, the history of the world. So here she is in her incredible, beautiful portrait made up of this mosaic and these tesserae. This is Saint Apollinaris. This is from a church called Saint Apollinaire in Classe. We can see here this is also in Ravenna in Italy, but this is a Byzantine church. This was built around the same time as the previous church that we just saw, as San Vitale. You can see Saint Apollinaris here in the middle under a large cross. The cross is surrounded by a mandorla, so it is emerging. We can see the stars in the sky representing the heavens. This is meant to represent an event from the Bible called the Transfiguration, where at one point Christ takes Peter, James, and John off to the side, and he appears to them in his sort of divine glory. He transfigures into his divine, godlike half. And in this moment, the prophet the prophets Elijah and Moses also appear because they were told to have foretold the coming of Christ. So what we're seeing is very much a sort of an image that is meant to show sort of the layers of sort of heaven and earth. We see at the very top the hand of God sort of parting the layers of heaven. Then we see this vision of Christ sort of represented in his divine state as this kind of golden cross surrounded by Elijah and Moses. And down below we see Saint Apollinaris looking at this vision, where we see sort of 3 sheep here representing the Trinity, and at the bottom we see another 12 representing the apostles. He is surrounded by images of a paradise. So once again, Christian, this sort of idea of sort of Christian belief divided into layers, sort of heaven and earth. And notice the incredible flatness we're seeing here. There's hardly any shading to make the figures look 3D. The figures are long and thin. We see those kind of triangular type folds, especially in the garments of Elijah and Moses. This is another transfiguration, and this isn't an image of a person having a vision of the transfiguration. This is the actual transfiguration. This comes from a church of the Virgin monastery at a monastery of St. Catherine, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. So here we see an image, once again, of Christ standing in a mandorla. Underneath, we see Peter, James, and John, then surrounded by the two prophets, Moses and Isaiah, as we saw earlier. By now, you should be familiar with the sort of visual strategies, the elongated forms, the triangular folds, etc., etc. Notice the gold background. The gold, of course, represents divinity. So in this image, we're not even seeing any kind of earthly forms, but instead this sort of gold leaf representing the heavenly realms. Manuscripts. We've already looked a little bit at some manuscripts. There were manuscripts, of course, in the Byzantine Empire. Next, we have a manuscript. So, as you guys probably remember, we studied manuscripts a little bit in the last chapter. But manuscripts are handwritten books. And this is an example of a manuscript called the Vienna Genesis. It's a book of Genesis. It was made for an imperial family, so this is a royal book. That's why the pages are purple. Purple is, of course, the color of royalty. Purple is the color of royalty because it was a very expensive dye made from an animal called murex. It's basically a bivalve, kind of a sea slug. This is its shell, and it produces this purple ink. But it's very rare and very hard to harvest, and that's why purple was associated with royalty, because it was a very expensive color. These are both pages from the Vienna Genesis. But let's take a close look at this image. This is an image of a story called Rebecca at the Well. And the story is that Abraham is looking for a wife, and he sends out a sort of messenger, a servant, to find a woman he thinks will be worthy, a woman who is good and kind, and all of these kinds of things. And the servant is hot, and he's parched, and he stops at this well, and this woman, Rebecca, sees this man in distress, and she brings him water, and he realizes, aha, this is the one. So what we are looking at here is something called a continuous narrative. Continuous narrative means that multiple scenes from the narrative are shown within the same picture frame. This is actually a holdover from scrolls. Remember, before books, the way written information was transmitted was scrolls, and so you read a scroll by unrolling it, right? And oftentimes the same scene would be pictured, or various scenes would be pictured on the same page, and you would sort of like scroll from right to left or left to right. And you could have multiple figures and sort of read it almost like you're reading a comic strip without it being divided into individual panels. And that's why we have two Rebeccas, because this is while she approaches the well, and this is her at the well. Now, you might be wondering why there is a naked woman just hanging out in the middle of this biblical story, and that is because this is a water nymph. Nymphs are nature spirits in Greek mythology, and it was not uncommon in ancient Greek art or ancient Roman art if you had like an image of a body of water to have a nymph in it. And even though this is a biblical image, we are very much in a Christian era at this point. These kinds of little visual cues would have been familiar to people, and they would have still used them even though they are pagan in origin. And so having a Greek water nymph or a Roman water nymph here in this biblical story was not out of the ordinary. Also, I want to point out the camels, of which there are 10 camels, and they, I think, have 7 feet in total. This is very similar to the image we saw in Dira Europa's with the image of David. And there were not enough feet to match all the bodies. And this is something very similar here, because in at this point in Christian art, the symbolic meaning is what's more important, and a kind of a naturalism or realism is not what these artists are going for. In fact, it's the opposite of what they are going for, because this could lead to idol worship. This is another book called the Rosanna Gospels. I'm not going to get a lot into this, although notice the pages are purple. denoting that this is a royal manuscript. And here we have the Rabula Gospels. So gospel books are something that very common we will see in the Middle Ages. Gospels are the four books that compose the story of Christ's life and death and resurrection. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is an image of the ascension of Christ as he goes into heaven in a mandorla with this odd creature with wings with eyes on it. This comes from a prophecy in the Bible. You'll notice there are four animals, a lion, a human, an eagle, and a bull or an ox. And it's interpreted both ways. These are animals that are symbols because they're seen in a prophecy, symbols of the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We'll talk more about the specifics of this in the next chapter, but that's what's going on here in this rather odd picture if you're not familiar with it. And then we have an image of the crucifixion here in the resurrection. And I'm just going to look at these in a brief way because what we are seeing here at this early age, at this early state in the 6th century is sort of the establishment of the kind of basic Christian iconography. In other words, the symbols that will be used in image after image after image, establishing these basic Christian stories in pictorial form. So that's what we're seeing here, sort of early versions of scenes that will be depicted in art hundreds of thousands of times throughout history. Okay, so we can't talk about the Byzantine period without talking about icons. Icons at their most basic are paintings of a sacred person that is a source of veneration. But what they really are images that are prayed to. They represent a saint or a holy figure, like in this case the Virgin Mary, and you pray to them. And even today in Eastern Orthodoxy, adherents will often have small icons in their home. Now, there was a fear that the icons were not just something that you sort of pray to, but that they were starting to be worshipped as idols. And there was a big fear. And so there was a group called iconoclasts who wanted to destroy these images. And this was spearheaded by several emperors in the 8th and 9th century. And so this era is often referred to as the iconoclasm, or the destruction of images, because of the Bible's, the second commandment says, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image." And so in the Byzantine Empire, they adhered to this very strictly, but thousands and thousands of images were destroyed. So we have actually very few icons or images at all, really, from this early period, with the exception of a handful that survived in a monastery called St. Catherine's in Egypt at Mount Sinai. But it wasn't until 843 that the iconoclasm ends. So for 150 years or so, thousands of images were destroyed. And so this brings us to the 9th century in the middle period, where we see a reaction against the iconoclasm. And this had to do partially to the influence of two empresses, an Empress Irene in 780 and another Theodora, a later Theodora, not the Theodora we just studied. And these women were known as iconocules. Iconocule is someone who wants to preserve icons, to preserve images. And at this point, we see a dynasty of Macedonians take over the empire, and they bring back the restoration of these icons. And also it sees a restoration of the empire in general. This is a very successful time for the Byzantine Empire. And Basil I is one of the main emperors at this period, and he sees himself as sort of a restorer of the Roman Empire. What we are looking at here is a Theotokos. In other words, the Mother of God. The Theotokos is a common image of the Virgin Mary sitting down with the Christ child in her lap. This is from Hagia Sophia. The original images in Hagia Sophia were destroyed in the iconoclasm, so the earliest ones we have date back to around the 9th century when images were restored, and so new images had to be created. So the earliest images from the 6th century don't exist, so the earliest we have. But this is very typical. You should recognize the Byzantine style by now, those triangular folds, the elongated bodies, the flattened images. This is very traditional this is a very traditional sort of Theotokos. This comes from a church of the Domitian at a place called Daphne. This is an image of Christ as the Pantocrator. Pantocrator means sort of the ruler of all. Pantocrator. And here we see Christ in his mandorla and in this dome. You can see it's surrounded by squinches. This is very typical Byzantine with the geometric folds and the drapery. You're familiar with this stuff by now. I want to point out something. Look at his face. And notice how one side of his face appears sort of smaller and has sort of wrinkles, and the other side appears a little bit different, a little bit younger. This is a symbol between of Christ, God's side, his divine side, and his earthly side. And the right and left are actually ancient symbols of good and evil. In fact, in many languages, the term for right literally means good or just, or like in our English language, right means correct, right? And left means, well, that which is other, that which is behind, right? But in Latin, the word for right is dexter, which means sort of goodness and ability and all those positive things, and left is sinister, bad. So left-handed people, like myself, there's always been a kind of a negative attitude towards the left because it is associated with evil. It is associated with the faulty side of things. And that's what we're seeing here. The left side is the human side, the side that is corruptible, the side that is susceptible to sin. The right side is the divine side, the good side. This is a later icon. By this time, after the icons were allowed back into the Byzantine Empire, there were a lot of really strict rules about them. And icon painters had to go through years of rigorous training where they had to learn certain rules, because you couldn't paint things to look too realistic, otherwise it could lead to idol worship, and there were very strict kinds of, once again, rules, regulations on what could be painted and how things could be painted. And this is very much a typical Theotokos, but you can tell it's a later Theotokos because unlike some of the earlier ones we saw, this is there's affection here. The Virgin is shown very much as a loving mother. But I want to point out something you've probably noticed about the faces of the Christ child in these images. Why he doesn't look like a baby, why he looks like a little man. And the reason for this is a concept called a homunculus, literally little man. But the idea is that this is a proof of Christ's manhood. This is a proof of his being part human, right? And so this became part of his standard iconography, this rather sort of mannish little head on this baby. And it's not because artists didn't necessarily know how to paint childlike faces, but it's because it wasn't part of the rules. And the last artist we're going to look at is a very famous artist named Andrei Rublev, who was an icon painter and one of the most famous painters, period, from the Byzantine Empire. By the time 11th century rolls around, a group called the Seljuk Turks have conquered Anatolia, or what is now Turkey. And this causes ultimately a split, an official split between Rome and and the Eastern and Western empires, and the churches now are completely separated, even though they were pretty much separated anyway. Now it's official. Also, the Byzantine Empire starts to really go through some major problems due to the Crusades. These are religious campaigns staged by the Catholic Church and rulers of Western Europe to regain the Holy Lands. But from the what were known as the Saracens or Muslims who controlled Jerusalem and many of the Holy Lands. But this meant that on their way to the Holy Lands, a lot of these Western Crusaders went through the Byzantine Empire. And at one point during the Fourth Crusade, the Venetians from Venice, Italy, decided that they were going to take these lands too, that the Eastern Orthodox Christians weren't true Christians, and so they needed to reclaim those lands for the Western. And this caused stress onto the Byzantine Empire. But by this time, Eastern Orthodoxy had spread north into Russia, where it still dominates today. And Andrei Rublev is a Russian artist, very much painted in this tradition. And you can see here this image of these three angels painted very much in this Byzantine traditional style. And I would say even by this point, the style has become so sort of formulaic and formalized that we see these folds sort of turned into these very, very simple, very strict kind of geometric sorts of triangles. Of course, with the use of the gold background denoting a kind of divine location. And that is it for the Byzantine Empire, guys. I'll see you next chapter. Take care.